and welcome to episode 10 of the Radio Man series. We're going to look at antennas today, and apologies because I've lost a load of the files. I had one of those ransomware attacks and I've had a lot of the files deleted. So I've discovered, while I was trying to rebuild things, one of the old episodes that was sort of done quite a while back. And it came to the surface this morning because I was reading on forums yet another one of those posts where people are looking at, which is the best aftermarket antenna for my portable radio. One of the files that I recovered was an older episode that I did where I compared a number of antennas that I was able to get together in one place and test. Now, I suppose I really need to explain a little bit about what the data is you'll see, because I came across the problem that to test an antenna on a portable radio set is practically impossible because your body becomes the ground plane, a small radio or a big radio, a plastic radio, a metal radio. Taking the antenna off, pulling it apart and trying to measure how good the antenna is was plagued. It just didn't work. The test was quite simple. Take a metal plate with a hole in the middle where I could attach each antenna under test, set up an RF source, and then with an attenuator, see how much I had to attenuate the transmitter to bring the receive signal down to a constant level. In effect, what you'll see on this video is a load of graphs. And essentially, the higher the graph, the better, because that's where I had to put the most attenuation in. So the antenna was doing a good job, well enough that in actual fact we needed to take it down and down and down and down to get it to the reference level. I'm making no attempt to quantify the reference level, but they were all done to the same, which is the important thing. And some of the antennas were over 40 dB on my attenuator. So some of them were doing a really good job. Quite a lot hovered around the 30 range, and a few were simply terrible. Now, what actually happened as well is that I have problems in deciding what the antennas are supposed to be. We can assume that most of these antennas are designed to operate in the two amateur bands, the VHF and the UHF bands. But looking at the graphs, quite a few of them seem to actually have performance that's not too bad in marine band, and a few don't do too badly in the business bands. But for people who are trying to use these things as scanner type receivers, you'll see that the actual performance is very peaky. So in one band it's perhaps 30, 40 dB on my attenuator level. But then in other bands like the marine band it's way down. So none of these antennas are particularly useful. In actual fact, the stock antenna on most radios is probably the most useful because it's reasonably short, does a pretty reasonable job at everything, and isn't terrible at anything. But some of these aftermarket ones are not consistent at all. Here's the video that we made before. Have a look and see if you can make any sense of all these different antennas.
Back in November I started buying a range of antennas for portable radios, and the reasoning behind this was that the forums are full of advice on which ones are best, and most have no actual performance data to rely on. In fact, looking at the claims made by all the manufacturers, the claims are at best vague, and some really make you raise your eyebrows. I've collected a nice variety of them now, and I've produced some proper data on how they work, so we can make some sense of the claims. Practically all the supplied antennas that come with the popular radios are all physically too short. A quarter wave for 2 meters would be 19 inches long, not exactly pocket sized, and the quarter wave for 70 centimeters is 6 and a bit inches long, so it's still quite big. As a result, all radios come with antennas that are much shorter than they really should be. The question is, these aftermarket ones, are they actually better or worse than the short ones? Here's the list of what I've actually tested. I started with the Nagoya NA771 in the orange packaging, the Nagoya NA771 in the green packaging. I've done the RH770, which is a telescopic antenna, the Nagoya 774, which is also telescopic, the Diamond RH771, the Sonic 641, the short version, the Sonic 661, the long one, the Nagoya 701, the Kinota green flexible antenna, the Diamond RH901, the Retivis RHD 771, the Opaksun 669C, and the Bofeng short with a green band version. This one I just saw on a couple of websites, and it seems to be an aftermarket Bofeng product designed for some of their radios. It's a short aerial with a green band on it. Some of these have SMA male connectors and some have SMA female, so check before you buy them. I didn't, but you probably ought to. Okay, now to the testing. This caused a great deal of grief. It became clear that to get meaningful results I'd have to use an artificial ground plane. So I drilled a piece of aluminium plate and all the antennas were tested mounted on this. It's too small to be a good ground plane, but probably better than the average body in hand we operate the radios with. I picked a test radio at random. In this case I used a Radio Oddity GD77 and I programmed 7 channels that I've licenses for spread across the radio's range. They were 145 450 in the amateur band, 159 250 in the centre of the marine band, and 169 1875 in the VHF business band. For UHF I selected 433 350, our local switched off repeater frequency, then 449.4 close to the 446 band, and then 453 3375 and 459 8375 for the business band. They're repeater channels. In the workshop I've set up a radio that has a signal strength readout and I've connected it to an external antenna through a stepped attenuator. The testing regime is simple. Transmit with the test antenna and then use the attenuator to produce the same signal level at the receiver input. The better the antenna performs, the more attenuation is required at the other end to produce the same input at the receiver. 7 measurements for each antenna. I found out quite early on that even low power was too high, so I had to attenuate the radio output power down to around about the 100 milliwatt level to get meaningful results at the receiver, and then I used this for all of them. I also took the opportunity to record the VSWR and the power output I used. This also showed how the radio responded to the varying VSWRs, and some were pretty high. Some had such bad VSWR that the reflected power was approaching the transmit power. This distorted the readings so much in the graphs that wherever the VSWR was over 30 to 1, I capped the data at that point. If you see 30, just treat that as very high and ignore it. For completeness, I also tested the stock antennas on a range of VHF and UHF business band radios I've got. To determine any meaningful figures for gain, I used 2 test quarter waves, one on the VHF handband and one on the UHF handband. The test antennas on VHF required 40 dB of attenuation to get my preferred signal strength at the receiver and 23 dB of attenuation to get the same signal strength at UHF. Any test result over these 2 figures signifies gain compared to the quarter wave dipole, and as you'll see, very few of these antennas have any gain in any meaningful way, and those that do only do it in the amateur band where they're clearly intended to operate by design. The test results show that the real question is how bad they are, not good, because most do a rather poor job at getting RF out of these radios. One is truly dire and I suspect faulty, and a couple of the others quite suspect. The stock antenna on the GD77 is rather good. It's also clear that most are pretty poor at VHF because they're physically too small. They may well match the transmitter, but they're inefficient. The only issue I cannot resolve is with the Nagoya NA771. I read all sorts of stories about some being genuine and some counterfeit, but I've got no idea which of the 2 I have is genuine, and of course they both could be, or they could both be fakes, but they're certainly different performers. Right, conclusions. For VHF, the Kinota green flexible antenna has some useful gain, but at UHF it's average, and it's actually quite poor at 449. The Nagoya 771 has a bit of gain at UHF, but again poorer at VHF. If you want a bit of gain at both VHF and UHF handbands, the Nagoya NA771 is good in the orange packet, but the green packet is inferior at VHF. Out of all these antennas, there are some pretty good performers, but as you can see, there's also quite a lot of very average ones. This doesn't mean they're bad, but the marketing hype infers good performance when very often the ones supplied with the radio are virtually the same. The telescopic RH770 showed some promise, but while UHF handbang performance is good, the super size of the beast is just impossible to cope with, and SMA is a wonderful electrical connector for its size, but we've all heard the stories of them snapping off. Possible flaws with the test. I took care to make the test process transparent. The only potential error in the system is the receive antenna, which is less sensitive at UHF, however. The test conditions remain consistent, and the only implication of the progressively poorer performance at UHF is that the UHF band results are lower on the graphs than they should be. My own estimate on the results is that the receive antenna is around 10 dB down on the performance it has at VHF. As this was applied to all test results equally, the distortion in the attenuation plots can be ignored, as all measurements are made as comparisons with each other. My conclusion is that the price of these antennas is not linked to their performance at all, and many claims about how good they perform are extremely suspect. There are a few decent ones, but some are pretty terrible performers, and one about as good as a piece of damp string. I hope you find this review helpful. For information, all the antennas were sourced directly from China, not from any distributor or dealer in the UK. As for the two that may be counterfeits, who knows? I've had to put the glasses on for this one because some of the writing is extremely small. I couldn't read it. So let's start with the Nagoya 771. 2 packets. One possibly a counterfeit, the other one possibly a counterfeit. I have no idea which one is a genuine, if either of them are. They come from China. That's as much as I know. This one is the Nagoya NA771. It's the one from the green packet. The printing is a bit odd. It's silk screen printing, but the Nagoya isn't actually in line. It says Nagoya TM for trademark, NA771 VHF/UHF. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. It's quite flexible. I think most people who buy these like them because they offer a bit more performance, and they appear to be not too bad to stick on an SMA. I think I'd be reasonably happy with one of these because being quite floppy, the pressure's not going to be quite so great. My feeling is, looking at this could well be the counterfeit, mainly because the printing's just a little bit iffy. Orange packet Nagoya NA771. The writing's much better on here. It's blue, it's in line. The grey writing on the other one was a slight warp to it, as if the silk screening had been done very cheaply. This one looks slightly different. It's bendy, no difference there. The physical construction at the bottom looks very same. If I had to put money on it, I'd bet the orange one is the genuine one. Got no way of knowing it, and to be honest, does it really matter? We'd all like to think we've bought the same product, but I guess it could just be a copy of a copy of a copy. It's difficult to tell, but anyway, not a bad antenna, and that's the Nagoya NA771. This one is the Sonic 661. It's actually a fairly thin antenna. It is quite flexible, bends. The moulding at the bottom is quite straightforward, quite hard wearing by the looks of it. So we've got the Sonic 661, again claimed to be a dual band antenna. This one, the Sonic 641, it's a short version of the previous one. Flexible, relatively small, very light, not particularly effective, unfortunately. And this one, the short Bofeng. It doesn't appear to have a model number. I'm just referring to it as the green band. Short, absolutely rigid. It does not bend at all. Very, very hard plastic. The Bofeng green band. claim to be dual band. We'll see. This one, I just refer to it as the knurled one. Sadly, not a wonderful performer. Nothing to get excited about. It's quite flexible. The only real identification mark on the bottom is just something that says FM 136 to 174 stroke 400 to 470. Well, it's a bit of metal inside of plastic, and it's got a fitting on the bottom. Other than that, not particularly impressed, I'm afraid. The Nagoya 774, blue writing like the 771s. Something to be gained there, I think. Short, very rigid. It's got an angle at the bottom, so you can bend it, and of course it extends, so it's telescopic. The Kenota, green, flexible. Surprisingly reasonable performer. It's extremely flexible. It doesn't appear to have any marks on it at all apart from a sticker. So it says Kenota, but it's just on a wraparound on here. The packet is the same, exactly the same as the Nagoya packets, the orange ones, but there's no branding or any kind on it whatsoever. So I'm thinking it's probably come from the same source, but it's a competent looking antenna. Quite nicely made. All green, all flexible, but they put a black cap on it. Who knows why. Another Nagoya. This time the blue writing's replaced with the silver grey colour. It says NA701 on it, VHF, UHF. Quite flexible. Sadly, the printing on it looks very similar to the one that we think might be a counterfeit on the NA771. So I'm not sure. Could well be genuine. Don't know. The green packet might be a clue. The Retivis RHD 771. It's one of the antennas with the opposite plug on the end. This one, male. Quite flexible, reasonably long. Gives you the impression of being quite nicely made. The plastic feels good. It's a slightly rubbery, shiny feeler to it, and it feels a bit heavier than some of the others too. So not a bad one. That's the Retivis. Next up, the Diamond RH771. Another very similar looking antenna. The bottom moulding looks very much the same. The blue print is exactly the same colour blue as the Nagoyas that we were talking about. It does say on here wideband receiving coverage. There doesn't appear to be much in the spec to back that up, but it's Diamond RH771 144/430 megahertz and wideband coverage. The unbranded RH770. Strange beast. Chrome at the bottom. The RH770, it says it's got wideband receive coverage. It's also said it's 144/430 megahertz. But the best bit, it extends and extends and extends. Now, both sections goes from that end to that end. That balancing that balancing on top of a radio worries me, because it's very rigid. I reckon that's a pretty good candidate to snap your antenna socket off. Performs actually quite well, but it's just a huge beast. The Diamond RH901S, very flexible at the top, centre loading coil, rigid but a little bit bendy at the bottom, and then the bottom says some very strange things. Diamond RH901S, made in Japan. I find the idea that this is made in Japan and then exported to China, who then export it again to the rest of the world, a bit difficult to believe. It also says it's a 900 megahertz capable antenna. It also says it's a wideband receive antenna too. I see nothing in the performance specs to back that up, but I didn't test it at 900 megs, so I'm going to ignore that. But a fairly nice looking aerial. I don't think I'd mind having that on a radio too much. Moving it like that doesn't seem to put a huge amount of stress on the connector. Some of the claims might be a bit odd. It's also the only diamond one that I've seen where the printing is in like a dark purple colour, which seems a bit odd. Probably an ideal candidate for a counterfeit. I don't know, I'm just guessing.
And that's where the original video finished. So it didn't really have much of a conclusion, did it? Apart from to say, I don't think there is a clear winner. Practically speaking, something like this, with all the claims for gain and popularity, I'm not really convinced myself at all. I think the extra length of this thing makes it have a wider capture area, which probably helps a little bit. But realistically, something this long is the limit. You can't put some of those extra long antennas on a portable radio. It's just crazy. And you often see ones on eBay, don't you, that people are selling because they've managed to snap off the antenna connector. I think that's more of a worry than anything else. But something like this could be worth it, but you don't want to spend a lot of money on it, because I doubt very much if you're going to notice much of a difference with it. Anyway, that's episode 10. I hope it was a little bit useful at least, and showed you some of the pitfalls with buying some of these aftermarket antennas. They can be good, they can be bad, but just be careful. Anyway, look after yourselves, and I'll see you on the next video. Take care.